Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Unmatched Adventures Tales to Amaze from Restoration Games. Unmatched Adventures comes with all of the components that you see here, including 2 villain miniatures, 2 villain health dials, a double-sided game board, 6 minion health dials, 6 minion tokens, 8 doom and alien tokens, 2 different villain action card decks, 6 different minion action card decks, 6 web and acid tokens, 4 player order markers, 4 invasion and bridge markers, an initiative card deck, 12 amazing event cards. The game also comes with 4 different character decks, various character-specific tokens and health dials, character summary cards, and miniatures and markers for characters and their character sidekicks. Finally, the game comes with 1 threat marker. Now, in this game, you can play against one of 2 main villains, either the Mothman or the Martian Invader. The rulebook recommends that you start off playing against the Mothman, so that's what we're going to be setting up for our example today. To begin setup, place the game board in the middle of the table. There are 2 sides of the game board, and the rulebook recommends starting off facing the Mothman, so we'll be using this side of the board. Then place the threat marker in the first space of the threat track. Shuffle the villain's action deck and then place that near the play area. And then set the villain's health tracker, giving them an amount of health depending on the player count. You should give the villain 10 health per player, and we're going to be setting up for a 2-player game, so we'll put 20 health. Then place the villain miniature on the starting space of the board, number 5. Then you'll need to choose minions equal to the player count that the players have to face off against in the game. Now, you can decide this randomly if you want to by selecting from the initiative cards, or you can just choose which minions you want to play against. In our example, we'll be facing off against the Skunk Ape and the Jersey Devil. After this has been done, you'll find the appropriate minion's action deck, shuffle those decks and place them near the play area, and then find their health dials and set each minion's health to 10. Then the minion's tokens would be placed in any adjacent space next to the main villain. A space is adjacent if it's connected by one of these lines here. Players would then begin to set up their characters by choosing a character and then placing them in any one of these starting spaces which have the numbers in a diamond next to them. We'll be playing with Annie Christmas and the Golden Bat. Each player will then find their character card and their deck of action cards and shuffle those, and find their health dials and sidekick tokens if they have any, as well as any additional components that you might have, like these Tesla coils if you're playing with that character, and place them in their play area. Players will then set the starting health on their health dial and the health dial of any of their sidekicks. A character or sidekick starting health can be seen on the player's character cards, or you can also just turn your dial to the highest number that has this little arrow underneath. That's the starting health as well. Then if a player has any sidekicks, like in the case of Annie Christmas, they can place that sidekick anywhere in the same zone that they're in to start the game. A zone is any space that shares the same color and pattern as the starting space of the hero. So in this example, all of these spaces would be in the same zone as Annie Christmas, including any of the spaces that only share half of the same color. These spaces are both in the purple zone and the light blue zone. So if the player wanted to, they could place their sidekick in this space here or this space here. We'll say that Annie chose to place Charlie here. Each player will then draw 5 cards from their shuffled action deck to form their starting hand, and each player will take the player order marker that matches up with their starting space, in this example 1 and 2. You'll then take all of the initiative cards for any of the minions, villains, and players playing in the game, shuffle them to form an initiative deck, and then place that deck near the play area. And then finally, there's some additional setup that needs to be done depending on which villain you're facing. For Mothman, you'll need to find the 4 bridge tokens, shuffle them randomly, and place one in between the spaces on the board that have bridge 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a cutout for them. When you're done, it should look something like this. Finally, create a supply of these Doom tokens somewhere near the board, and place one of these Doom tokens on the bridge that's in bridge space 1. After this has been done, you're ready to play. In Unmatched Adventures, players are trying to defeat the villain by reducing its health to 0. The villain wins by either completing its objective, which is different for the Mothman and the Martian Invader, or knocking out all of the fighters and their sidekicks. Villains' objectives and goals will be advanced whenever the threat marker reaches the end of the threat track. Different things happen whenever this occurs based on whether you're playing the Mothman or the Martian Invader, and we'll get into more details about the villain goals later in the video. But just know that whenever this marker reaches the end of the track, something bad happens for the players. Unmatched Adventures is played over a series of rounds, and a round will be over once all cards in the initiative deck have been revealed and resolved. Turn order in this game is random. At the start of each round, the top card of the initiative deck will be revealed, and this will determine which player, villain, or minion will get to take their turn. In this example, the first person to take a turn in this round is player 2. After player 2 fully resolves their turn, another initiative card would be revealed, and in this case, the Jersey Devil would take their turn. This will continue until all of the initiative cards have been revealed and resolved, and then the end of the round will occur. The deck will be shuffled up, and players will complete this process until the game is over. When a player initiative card is revealed, that player will take their turn. In this example, player 2 would take their turn, and in our case, player 2 is being controlled by the Golden Bat. On a player's turn, they would take 2 actions, and the types of actions they can take are listed on the back of their player card. Players could either maneuver, scheme, or attack. Players can take different actions or the same action multiple times if they wish. We'll look at each action in detail, starting with maneuver. When a player takes a maneuver action, they'll perform 2 steps. First, they'll always draw a card, and this step is mandatory. A player is able to move their fighter and any of their sidekicks up to the listed move value on their character card, and if they want to, they could boost this move value by discarding 1 card. If a player wants to discard a card to increase their move value, they would discard the card, and then they would add this value in the circle on the card to their move value. So in this instance, if the Golden Bat decided to boost their move value, they would add this 2 to the 3, making their move for this maneuver action 5. This can be very useful if you need to get to a certain space that exceeds your move value, but you have to discard this card so you would lose any actions or defense or attack that it would provide. In this instance, we'll say that Golden Bat didn't choose to boost and is just moving up to their normal move value of 3. Actually moving your character or any of your sidekicks is optional when taking a maneuver action, so you don't have to if you don't want to. When moving, characters can travel along spaces that are connected by these lines. These spaces are considered to be adjacent. So if they wanted to, Golden Bat could move 2 spaces right here, traveling along these lines, ending their movement here where they're adjacent to an opposing minion. It's also important to note that spaces with the bridges are considered to be adjacent as well. You can see the lines printed on the bridge as well. So if a player were to end their movement right here, they would still be adjacent to this space because they're connected by a bridge. It's important to note, however, that if a bridge is removed, then those spaces are no longer adjacent. If a character has any sidekicks when they take a maneuver action, both their character and their sidekick or sidekicks can move up to their movement value. So for instance, with Annie Christmas, she has the sidekick Charlie, and whenever she takes a maneuver action, both Annie and Charlie can move up to 2 spaces, which is her move value. It's also important to note that if the player controlling Annie Christmas were to boost their move value, both her move value and Charlie's move value would be increased. So if this player boosted their move value to 4, Charlie could, say, move these 2 spaces here, and then Annie Christmas could move 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces to end right here. It's also important to note that when characters move, they can move through friendly fighters if they want to, so Annie Christmas could move through Charlie, but no one can move through an opposing fighter. So for instance, Annie wouldn't be able to move through the Skunk Ape and vice versa. There are special actions that players or sidekicks can take if they end their movement adjacent to a bridge, but we'll look at that in more detail whenever we talk about the special rules for playing against the Mothman. The next type of action that a player could take on their turn, if they wanted to, would be to play a scheme card. Scheme cards are easily distinguished by this lightning bolt symbol in the top left, and taking a scheme action is very simple. To do this, you would simply play the card that has the scheme icon follow the text on the card, and then discard it after resolving those effects. Scheme cards provide very powerful one-time effects that will help players succeed throughout the game. For instance, this card allows the Golden Bat to regain one of the cards from their discard pile and draw additional cards as well as move. There are some card effects, like this one here, that will say to place the Golden Bat in any space. This doesn't count as a maneuver action, which is very important for the Golden Bat. Each character has a special ability that will impact gameplay in a certain way. For instance, Golden Bat's the first superhero ability says that if he hasn't taken a maneuver action on the turn, all of his attacks would have +2. This scheme card would allow him to move to any space and then attack without having maneuvered. There are also some cards that state deal damage to opposing fighters, and it's important to note that this damage can't be defended and would simply reduce the opposing fighter's health. And there may be some scheme cards or effects that allow players to gain an action, like this scheme card here. This would allow a player to take an additional action on their turn, on top of the 2 that they already gain. So for instance, if Annie were to play this scheme card, she would get to resolve its effects and then take 3 actions this turn instead of her normal 2. Now that we've looked at the scheme action, the last type of action that a player can take on their turn is to attack. Characters will be able to attack adjacent opposing fighters if they have the melee trait, or if characters have the ranged trait, they can attack people within their zone. So for instance, in this scenario here, Annie Christmas could attack either the Skunk Ape or the Mothman because both opposing fighters are adjacent, or Charlie could attack any one of the opposing fighters because they all share the same zone with the zone that Charlie is currently in. As a reminder, any of these spaces that show 2 different colors are considered to be in both zones. So by being in this space, Charlie is in both the green zone and this light bluish purple zone. When making an attack, a player has to declare who's making the attack and who the target is. So for instance, the Annie Christmas player could say that Charlie is making the attack and then pick one of the 3 available targets. When making an attack, the attacker has to choose one attack card from their hand and then play that card. If a player controls more than one fighter, like in the case of Annie Christmas where she has Charlie as a sidekick, the card that's played has to be usable by that character. For instance, you could see on the side of the cards here, they list which character can use these particular cards. This card has to be used by Charlie. This card could be used by any, meaning Charlie or Annie Christmas, and this card has to be used when attacking with Annie. It's also important to note that when making an attack, players have to use a card that either has the attack symbol or the versatile symbol, which shows this burst symbol and a shield. These cards can be used to either attack or defend. Now, defending against an attack is something that we'll look at later in the video, but just know that for the purposes of attacking, these cards can be used for an attack, or these cards can be used for an attack. Since the Annie Christmas player declared Charlie as the attacker, they could use either this card or this card during this attack. When attacking against one of the minions or villains, the minion or villain will always play a card to try and help defend. So in this example, we'll say that Charlie is attacking the Skunk Ape. The top card of the Skunk Ape's deck would be played and then revealed after Charlie had played their card. Whenever resolving combat, the attacker will compare their attack value versus the defense value of the defender's card. Now, minions and villains will use the same cards for attack and defense, so in this example, the minion's card has an attack value of 2 and a defense value of 2, but we're just looking at the defense value for this particular interaction, since the minion is defending. In addition to the base value, each card will usually have some type of an effect. For instance, in this example, Charlie's card has an immediately effect and the Skunk Ape's card has a during combat effect. There are 3 types of effects and different timing associated with each. Immediately cards will have abilities that take effect before combat is resolved. During combat abilities will have effects that resolve during the combat as the card lists. And then there will be some cards that have after combat effects like you can see here. If there's ever an example where there's a tie and both players have an immediately effect, for instance, the defender would always be able to resolve their ability first. So in this example, if Skunk Ape had revealed an immediately card, their immediately effect would take place before Charlie's immediately effect would take place. In this particular example, the Skunk Ape has a during combat effect that will very negatively affect Charlie since Charlie is a sidekick. Luckily for Charlie, he has an immediately ability that he can resolve before the during combat effect. This card states that if you reveal 2 cards with the same name from your hand, you can cancel all the effects on your opponent's card. When canceling effects, you would simply cancel the listed effect, but you wouldn't cancel the value of the card. There are some cards, however, that will cancel values or alter values, but if a card does that, it will specifically list value and not effect. So in this example, by playing this immediately ability, Charlie has an effect that will take place before the during combat effect can resolve. So in this example, players would then simply compare the two values on their cards. When comparing values, if the attacker's value is higher than the defender's value, like in this example here, the attacker would do damage equal to the difference. So 3 minus 2 equals 1, which means that the skunk ape's health value would be reduced by 1. After that's been done, both cards would be discarded, and that attack action would be resolved. If the attacker's value is less or just equal to the defender's value, the attacker won't take any damage for having a lower value in that case. The attack would simply not be successful and the defender would take no damage. So if this card had been played instead of the card we looked at earlier, the skunk ape's ability would resolve, making its defense a 5 against Charlie's attack of 2, which would mean that the attack wasn't successful, and neither fighter would take any damage. There are also some cards that have after combat effects, like what you see here. In this example, after the combat would fully be resolved, this player would be able to draw 2 cards. There may also be after combat effects that the minions or villains may do as well. There are also some cards that have abilities that say if you won the combat, do something, like in this example here. An attacker is considered to have won the combat if they deal at least 1 damage from the value on their card. A defender is considered to have won the combat if they didn't take any damage from the value on the card. It's important to note that even if a defender took damage from an ability on a card, the attacker doesn't win the combat unless their card does damage from its base value. So in this example, even though Annie would deal 1 damage to the opposing fighter, she wouldn't have won the combat because her value was lower. It's also important to note that on some villain or minion cards, there are effects that only take place for the attack and not in the defense. So in this example here, there's a bar separating the text in the attack box versus the defense box. If this card is played as an attack, this effect will take place, but if this card is played as a defense card, no effects would happen. We'll look at how a minion attacks shortly. Whenever a minion is defeated by having its health reduced to 0, you would remove the minion's cards, health dial, and their token, and then their initiative card would be removed from the lineup if it was already out. If it hadn't yet been revealed and this character was removed, whenever it would be revealed, it would simply be discarded and the next initiative card would be revealed. The last thing to mention here is that attack values can be potentially increased by characters' special abilities. For instance, with Annie Christmas, she has an ability that says she can add 2 to the value of her attacks if she has less health than the defender. Now, it's important to note that some abilities are only available to be taken by the listed character. So for instance, Annie has this special ability, but Charlie doesn't. And when an ability or a card says to add to the value of a card, that means to this listed value here. So for instance, if Annie were attacking the Mothman, who currently has 20 health, her ability would trigger, making this card a value of 3 instead of 1. The Golden Bat has an ability that works in a very similar way, but he gets to add values to his attacks if he hasn't maneuvered during the turn. And we'll look at the other 2 characters and their special abilities near the end of the video. Now that we've looked at all of the potential actions that a player can take on their turn, it's time to look at minion and villain turns and what they do. Whenever a villain or a minion card is revealed, they would take a turn. On many of the villain or minion cards, there's a right now effect listed on the top of the card, which is just the Jersey Devil or another minion takes their turn. And then many times there will also be an end of round effect. Whenever a minion or a villain card is revealed, you would only resolve any right now effects on those cards. The end of round effects aren't resolved until the end of the round, which is a step that we'll look at later in the video. You may also notice that there's a move value listed on all of the minion and villain cards. Each of the villain and minions have a move value of 3. When a minion or a villain takes a turn, they won't take 2 actions just like a normal player character would. They simply try and move to the closest fighter, whether that be a character or a sidekick, and attack that character. And when considering which fighter to target, minions and villains will first look for any fighters that are adjacent. So in this instance, the Jersey Devil would simply choose Golden Bat, as that person is the only fighter adjacent. If there were a situation where more than one fighter was adjacent, then the players get to choose which character is attacked. If no fighters are adjacent, each minion or villain would look to see which fighter they can move to be adjacent to that's within their movement range. So for instance, for the Jersey Devil, currently they could move 1, 2, 3 spaces and be adjacent to the Golden Bat, and that would be within their movement range of 3. But the closer fighter is actually moving 2 spaces to attack Charlie here. So in this scenario, the Jersey Devil would move here to attack Charlie. It's important to note as well that villains and minions can move through other villains and minions just like fighters can move through other friendly fighters. But they would have to end their movement on a space that's empty and unoccupied. If an enemy or a minion isn't able to move so that they're adjacent to one of the players, for instance, they're not able to reach one of the characters with their movement range, then they would instead simply increase the threat level by 1 and their turn would be over. If, however, an enemy or a minion is able to move to be adjacent to one of the characters, then they would attack. If an enemy or a minion attacks, then the top card of their action deck would be placed face down. Then the player who controls the character or the sidekick who's being attacked would get to choose if they want to play a defense card, and they have to make that decision before this card is revealed. When playing a card for defense instead of an attack card, the card has to have either the versatile symbol or the defense symbol, and once again, the card has to be able to be played by the character or the sidekick that's being attacked. So in this instance, this defense card would work because it says any, which means that either Annie or Charlie could play it. But since Charlie's the one being attacked, they couldn't use this card because it specifically lists Annie as the one who can play it. After choosing a card to play, the attacking card would then be revealed, and the attack would be resolved just like when a player character attacks, but in reverse. Any effects on the cards would be resolved during their normal timing, and since the player character is the one defending in this example, they would win any ties in case of the same timing being played. In this case, the Jersey Devil has an ability that would be resolved if this card were already in this player's discard pile, which it's not. So the players would simply compare the attack value versus their defense value. In this case, the Jersey Devil would win the fight and do 1 damage since their 3 is 1 more than the 2 defense. After this damage is resolved, Charlie's health dial would be reduced by 1, and then after the combat, the player would be able to draw 2 cards, and then both cards would be placed in their appropriate discard piles. If a main character or a sidekick is ever knocked out completely, that character would be removed from the board, and any cards in the deck that list their name specifically can no longer be played for their main effects, although they could still be played as boost cards for things like movement or if an attack allows you to boost that attack. It's also important to note that even if a sidekick is knocked out of the game, this player can still play, they would just control the other character that hadn't been knocked out. This also holds true if the main character is knocked out but the sidekick still has health value. The player would still be able to play controlling the sidekick and playing their cards. Each villain and minion will also have a deception card in their deck. If this card is ever put into the discard pile, for instance if it were revealed and played as a defense or an attack card, then all of the cards in this character deck, including the cards in the discard pile, would be shuffled, and then a new draw deck would be formed. With player decks, if a player ever needs to draw cards and they can't, that means that their fighter is exhausted, and every time they would need to draw a card, they wouldn't reshuffle their discard pile. Instead, their fighter would take 2 damage for every card they can't draw. It's also important to note that enemies don't have a hand of cards, so if there's ever an effect on a card that would reveal an enemy hand or allow a player to look at an enemy's hand, the players would instead simply look at the top card of the deck. And if an enemy is ever forced to discard any number of cards, those cards are simply placed from the top of its deck into the discard pile. Also, there are some cards that say to place an enemy in an empty starting space. And as a reminder, the starting spaces are the ones that have these numbers in the black diamonds. And if an enemy is already in a starting space when this effect would need to take place, they must move to another starting space. Once all of the cards from the initiative deck have been revealed, and all minions, villains, and players have taken their turn, it would then be the end of the round. And all of the end of the round effects at the bottom of the initiative cards would be resolved one at a time from left to right. Some of the cards don't have an end of the round effect, like many of the player cards for instance, but most if not all of the villain and the minion cards would have end of round effects at the bottom of their cards. And they're always bad for the players. For instance, the Jersey Devil makes players in their zone discard cards equal to the threat level, which once again is where the marker is on the current threat track. Skunk Ape would deal damage equal to the current threat level to one hero or sidekick that's adjacent to Skunk Ape, and then Mothman would advance the threat marker a number of spaces equal to 1 plus the number of Doom tokens on the lowest numbered bridge. After all end of round effects are revealed in the initiative lineup, all of the initiative cards would be shuffled to form a new initiative deck, and the next round would start with revealing the top card from the deck again. Now's a good time to talk about the bridges, and how players can interact with them and how they'll help Mothman. As indicated on the end of round effect, each bridge has a number. For instance, this is bridge 1. So Mothman's effect would increase the threat level by 1 plus the number of Doom tokens on this lowered numbered bridge. So in this example, 2 spaces. If the threat level would ever reach the end of the track, any excess movement is lost, and a bridge is destroyed. Whenever a bridge is destroyed, any of the Doom tokens on that bridge that was destroyed would then move to the next bridge with the lowest number. Then the players would have to put the bridge face down in the next lowest destroyed bridge space. And they would have to resolve both of the effects below the bridge that was just placed down. In this example, placing Mothman adjacent to the hero with the lowest health, and then each player having to discard a card. After resolving the effect at the end of the threat track, the marker would then be moved back to the first space. If all 4 bridges are ever destroyed, Mothman would immediately win. It's important to note that players can interact with bridges too, however. If after a maneuver action, a player is ever adjacent to one of the bridges, either with their character or with a sidekick, they're able to discard any card from their hand that they want, and then remove Doom tokens from the bridge equal to the boost value of the card. So in this example, the Doom token would be removed, and that bridge would then be cleared of those tokens. In addition, each time a bridge is activated in this way, the players would get to resolve the special ability of the bridge. This bridge, for instance, allows a fighter to be moved up to 3 spaces, and it doesn't have to be the fighter that activated the bridge. This bridge would allow any player to draw until they have 4 cards. This bridge would allow the players to reveal the top 2 cards of any enemy or minion deck, and then discard one of them. And then this bridge would allow any fighter to recover 3 health. Players will continue to play round after round until either the villain's objective is completed, or all of the characters and sidekicks are knocked out of the game, or until the villain is defeated. If the villain is defeated, the players will win, and if all of the characters and sidekicks are defeated or the villain's goals are met, the players would lose. Now that we've looked at how to play the game, let's take a look at some of the minions and their special abilities and the other player characters and their special abilities. The Loveland Frog doesn't hit hard, but it does have an ability at the end of each round where it will add a Loveland Frog Strikes Again card into the initiative deck. These Loveland Frog cards will allow the Loveland Frog to take additional turns each time this card is revealed from the initiative deck. The Ant Queen has an ability each round that will advance the threat marker, and then it will potentially add a Strange Pheromone card into the deck. These Strange Pheromone cards won't allow the Ant Queen to take additional turns, but they each have an additional end of round effect that has to be resolved when completing the end of round steps. The Tarantula minion will add web tokens onto the board. Anytime a hero or a sidekick would enter a space with a web token, they have to end their movement. They could move again then with a new action or effect, and a hero or a sidekick would be able to ignore the web's effect if there's a friendly fighter already on that space. And finally, the Blob at the end of each round would put out acid tokens. Acid tokens are similar to web tokens, except that when a hero or sidekick enters an acid token space, they would take 1 damage. They don't stop movement, and once again, a hero or sidekick would be able to ignore the acid effect if there's already a friendly fighter on that space. Dr. Jill Trent has the special ability of Gadgetology. At the start of their turn, The player who's controlling Dr. Jill Trent would be able to pick one side of Dr. Trent's gadget, either the Hypno Ray Blaster or the Ultra Biotic Tonic. Whenever Jill Trent attacks, she's able to resolve the effect of the current gadget that's face up. And once again, this ability only applies to Dr. Jill Trent, not to her sidekick Daisy. Nikola Tesla has the special ability of using electric coils. At the start of the game, only one coil will be charged, but at the end of each of their turns, the player controlling Tesla is able to charge one coil. And at the start of each of Tesla's turns, if both coils are charged, you get to deal 1 damage to each opposing fighter that's adjacent to Tesla, and move them up to 1 space. There are also many cards in Tesla's deck that will have multiple different effects if coils are discharged. For instance, after resolving this card, you could uncharge 1 coil to discard the card that's listed in this during combat ability, and if both coils are spent, then you would also get to add the bottom ability. Many cards have double effects that can be resolved this way when playing Tesla. You now know everything you need to know to play against the Mothman, and once you have a good feeling for the Mothman and want more of a challenge, you can explore the Martian Invader. Please see the rulebook that explains the Martian Invader in more detail. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email me directly at thediceyreview@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to answer those questions for you if I can. Also, as always, if you enjoy what we're doing and the videos that we're putting out, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever we put out new content in the future. Alright, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.